With that, I am going to pass the ball here to Heidi to talk about some of these materials that I was talking about that you'll be able to show your legislator. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second and let Heidi share hers.
Great. Thanks, Matt. Yeah, I'm going to hopefully share my screen successfully here. And can everybody see that? So this is designed to be a resource for you to give you some more information and contexts, hopefully increase your confidence in talking with your legislators, and also for you to be able to share this with your legislators. You'll have access to this whole slide deck that I've created, and I'll be creating a hard copy packet too. And as Matt said, the goal is to have these conversations now in October and November to make sure that legislators know this is important to their constituents and to plant seeds and hopefully get them more interested in co-sponsoring or sponsoring climate legislation. So first of all, we want the legislators to understand that there is an overwhelming will to act on climate change. Not everybody knows this, though, because we're the underdogs against a multi-billion-dollar industry that's been spending hundreds of millions of dollars to prevent climate action and also to make people feel hopeless and make people think not very many people support this. So, although we're the underdogs, we must not fail, and we want our legislators to know we're counting on them. So, first of all, there is tremendous will to act here. It is a scientific consensus at this point that the primary cause of climate change is humans using fossil fuels. There's been a review of 90,000 peer-reviewed studies, and virtually 100% of them agree on this. The world agrees, countries agree. 198 countries have signed an agreement to transition away from fossil fuels and work to reduce climate pollution. Even North Korea and even petrostates that depend mainly on selling fossil fuels for their income. The regular people around the world, 89%, want their government to do more on climate. But in America, 3/4 of Americans want this. But nobody realizes it. When they're asked, how many people do you think support government climate action? People think only 40% of Americans want strong climate action. So it's important that legislators know that even if they think a minority of people support climate action, it's actually a majority. Here's a graphic, if it's useful for you, of the 198 countries who've agreed to transition away from fossil fuels. And here is just a graph showing the difference between the real support for government climate action on the left and what people think is the amount of support. In fact, people feel so strongly about this that about half of Americans said that they would be willing to give 1% of their income to the cause of fighting for climate action. And it's imperative that we succeed. Every 10th of a degree of warming that we can prevent saves millions of lives globally and prevents 100 million people from needing to migrate out of regions that have become uninhabitable. In the US, particularly in Colorado in the West, we're expected to have the most increased deaths from extreme heat. And if we fail by 2100, Colorado's average temperatures would be up to 11 degrees Fahrenheit higher than if we're successful. And of course, the extremes will be far higher than that. So even though, as we've seen, there's massive support for climate policy, the polluters have used their deep pockets to prevent action and to make people feel alone and helpless with the goal of keeping the world hooked on fossil fuels as long as possible. And they do have deep pockets. We took a look at the profits of four of the major oil and gas companies that do business and exert influence in Colorado. And just in the first half of 2023 alone, these four companies had profits of over $48 billion. So we're the underdogs, but we must not fail. Next are some resources to help you understand and mainly to help your legislators understand how urgent this crisis is. I know that all of you understand this because you're here and you're volunteering and you're trying to take action, but we need the legislators to understand this. The world is warming faster than scientists thought, and these impacts are already happening. It's not in the future. And the impacts are costing a lot of money, but it is possible to slow it down. So there is an article called Perilous Times on Planet Earth, which you will have access to share with your legislators, that contains some of these facts on how quickly we're approaching or passing irreversible tipping points. But something that really popped out to me was that the past 10 years have been the hottest 10 years on record, and 2024 was the hottest of all. And we're seeing the sea ice levels in the past 2 years just dramatically lower than they have been, and the sea and air temperatures dramatically higher. And the thing that happens is more warming begets more warming. So as this warming speeds up, permafrost melts and that releases more greenhouse gases. There's more wildfires, so that creates more greenhouse gases. And ecosystems get degraded where previously they would store carbon and now they release it. So basically, things are as bad or worse than scientists have predicted. And it's very urgent and we must act now. Here's some of the graphs I was talking about. You can see the gray lines are like the average over the past 20 years or so. The temperatures are gradually going up. The sea ice is gradually going down. But in 2023 and 2024, which are the blue and the red lines, you can see they're extremely higher than any previous years or extremely lower. And that's been alarming scientists. And maybe this is a way to point to this urgency. Impacts are already happening, and this slide will give you some facts at your fingertips. The World Health Organization says climate change is the #1 public health threat. All of this extreme weather and droughts is already impacting food supplies, causing deaths, and that we're seeing mass climate migrations already. Extreme heat is already causing, directly or indirectly, about 500,000 deaths annually. Floods are another major cause of death and devastation. Currently, deaths from floods are averaging about 60,000 per year, and they impact more people than that, with loss of home and property, making millions of people homeless. But what people often don't think about is that incomes will actually be reduced. Um, since money seems to talk, legislators should know that by 2050, the world is going to see a 19% reduction of income. And rich countries are affected less by this, but the US income reduction will be 11% by 2050. So that we're talking $38 trillion in reduced income globally by 2050. And if we don't succeed in reducing emissions, this devastation will triple by the end of the century. And here's a little graph that I made. The 5 biggest oil and gas companies in 2024 made 102 billion globally in profit. If we multiply that out over 25 years, we can see big oil and gas profits over 25 years here on the left. And that is just dwarfed by the income loss by the rest of us, global income loss over 25 years. Is it worth it? And comparing the biggest oil and gas companies' profit to the annual global cost of climate change, we're not talking income here, but we're talking devastation and recovering from disasters and stuff like that. It's triple. The damages of climate change are triple the profits of the oil and gas companies. They profit and we pay. And here's some examples of why it's costing money, why climate change is costing money. Adaptation costs, disaster mitigation and recovery, hardening our infrastructure to make it be able to withstand the more extreme weather and the higher temperatures. And it will also need to be repaired more frequently. We'll need cooling centers and assistance for households to cool and weatherize. And there will be a tremendous cost to industries such as agriculture and outdoor recreation, and also rising healthcare costs. So here's some impacts that are happening nationally. The Department of Defense had actually declared climate change to be an urgent national security threat. Here, as in the rest of the world, heat-related deaths are on the rise, and farming and food production is being affected. And then we have climate-related disasters and all of the impacts from those, including insurance canceled and rates raised. And there's a figure showing how much weather and climate disasters have caused over the time period of 1980 to 2024. Almost $3 trillion. And many of these have actually been scientifically attributed to climate change. Here's a more local information about impacts specific to Colorado. Of course, the national impacts also apply here. But Colorado has warmed more than the national average, especially Western Colorado, which has basically warmed more than twice the national average. We are also in a mega drought, and the economic cost of that mega drought has been computed to be, by 2030, almost $1 billion per year. And we've already suffered up to $50 billion in climate-caused disasters. Currently, health impacts are being felt by almost 2 million adult Coloradans. And as I've already mentioned, with high emissions, our temperature rise could be 11 degrees Fahrenheit higher than if we're successful. It's impacting our industries. The oil and gas industry seems to hold enormous power over legislators to be concerned about the impacts of climate adaptation and mitigation to the oil and gas industry. But really, our outdoor recreation and our ski industry are being harmed by climate change, and that's costing us a lot of money too. And you can get some facts and figures about the ski industry and outdoor recreation from this slide. Something I learned that I didn't realize is that in eastern Colorado, the Republican River Basin is already experiencing so much water loss that by law, they have to stop irrigating 25,000 acres because of water agreements downstream and stuff. And water wells are at risk. Almost $3 billion of agricultural products are at risk in eastern Colorado already. So legislators need to know they should be prioritizing agriculture and recreation and not prioritizing the fossil fuel industry. Excuse me. Here's a slide to give you some specific impacts that the government recognizes that Colorado is already experiencing. And here's a little bit more detail. Ecosystems are suffering because as heat gets more extreme and there's higher water temperature, we're losing species. Food chains are being disrupted. Species are having to gradually relocate to higher elevations for cooler temperatures, but that's also disrupting their food chains. And we're having increasing forest pest infestations. And there's some facts and figures about the water loss to the Colorado River, which impacts us, and it also impacts all the way downstream to New Mexico and the Gulf of Mexico. As we all know, wildfire risk is already here, and we've had the 20 largest fires since 2020. What people may not know is that once an area has been damaged by wildfire and by drought also, they're more vulnerable to floods and mudslides when we have the extreme storms. These results here on this slide are the results of a 2023 survey on self-reported impacts from climate, respiratory illness, mental health, heat stroke and heat illness, and many other impacts. And these were self-reported impacts. On the next slide, you'll see some studies, scientific studies that demonstrate these impacts. Wildfires themselves have a lot of direct and indirect health impacts. And as of 2012, over 2 million Coloradans live in these high-risk areas, like on the edge of wildlands. And we saw that with the Marshall Fire. More and more people are living in areas that are at risk of wildfire. Here are the impacts that have been shown by science from climate change, health risks. So, sorry about all the gloom and doom, but we need to be educated here so that we can make sure our legislators understand the urgency. However, we don't want them to think that it's hopeless. Scientists do know that there's time to drastically reduce emissions and stabilize the climate. But no matter what, every fraction of a degree makes a huge difference, and we need to convey that to the legislators, that it's very, very urgent, but there are things that they can do. Here are some policy resources that you can give to them. There's a group called Climate Exchange that has a dashboard showing each state's progress, and you'll have these links so that you can look at them as well. Colorado is actually ranked pretty high compared to many other states, but there's still gaps. There's still many areas where we can enact more policies to improve. It shows our emission reduction progress, and we'll see that we're behind schedule. The progress basically comes to a standstill at 2030 when we actually need to get down to zero by 2050. So we need more policies, we need stronger policies and better enforcement. This resource has explainers for each policy, and it also, legislators can reach out to them for policy help. Then we have a caucus of environmental legislators that has a website. This is broad, general environmental protection, but many of the issues overlap with climate. This resource shows current legislation that's happening, and it tracks the progress. It gives links to the actual legislation and policy. It has a lot of other resources for legislators like briefing books, explainers, and fact sheets. So I'm going to give a quick overview of policy and general ideas. All of these policies can work together. So your legislator may be interested in a different area than maybe is your passion, but all of these can work together and they're all needed. So first, under energy, mainly we need to beef up the renewables. We need to transition away from using fossil fuels and producing it. And we overall need to just reduce our energy use through energy efficiency. Then the earth can also be a good source of carbon sequestration. It's a good solution. We need to restore ecosystems. We need to protect our natural areas. And then we need to practice regenerative agriculture to restore soil. So any policies that encourage these things are going to be useful. And then land use choices are also important. As we develop more land, we need to make sure that it's climate resilient. We need to make sure that we keep to as small of a footprint as possible and that it's location efficient. In other words, people are living near their shopping, living near where they work, and that our choices lead to healthy and resilient natural and working lands. So we're going to focus a lot on energy tonight because energy production and use in Colorado is almost 85% of our climate pollution. And the United Nations and the IPCC have come out with a blueprint saying that in order to reach the climate goals and reach the emissions reduction we need, the world has to triple renewables development. And just so you know, I have a lot of resources showing that it is possible to get all of our electric energy needs from renewables if we have enough battery storage. So when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining, we are storing all that energy to be able to release it into the grid. And we also can have a lot of like localized energy generation that can be put back into the grid. And geothermal can make this even easier. Legislators need to know that solar and wind are by far cheaper than all of the other potential sources of energy generation, and they achieve the most pollution reduction. Since data centers are becoming a thing, we need to make sure that they use renewables and don't cause our rates to go up. In addition to developing the renewables, that's not enough. We need to also stop using fossil fuels. Instead of using more energy, fossil fuels and renewables, we need to switch. So we need to policy to encourage and make possible fast electrification of homes, businesses, transportation, and industry. And this will actually save massive amounts of money over time. We also need to reduce the energy use, as I've already mentioned. So to drill in and get a little more specific, to help with rapid build out of renewable energy, we need stronger emissions reduction requirements for both electric and gas utilities. For electric power, the governor is suggesting requiring 100% by 2040. It should actually be a little sooner than that, according to recommendations for a 2/3 chance of avoiding the worst impacts. And then we also need reduction targets for the gas utilities, so for reducing emissions from home and building heating. We need to decentralize and democratize the electric energy so that the grid is more resilient and energy is more affordable. So there's some specific examples there to incentivize and encourage local microgrids, neighborhood geothermal, plug-in balcony solar, virtual power plants, and distributed energy resources. And then it's not enough to have it ready to go. We also need to remove the barriers so that it's accessible to everybody and it's happening fast, such as streamlined permitting for solar, having utility bills that build into them financing for improvements such as electric heat pumps and weatherization and energy efficiency, so that if you can't afford to do the upfront costs, you can finance it on your electric bill. And we also need, along with incentives and rebates, we need actual grants and assistance for lower income households because they can't always take advantage of tax incentives and they need help with the upfront costs. As I said, it's not enough to build out the renewables. We need to stop using fossil fuels. So policies that require new buildings to meet their energy needs with electric and geothermal, incentives and assistance for retrofitting existing buildings. And then in electric power, we don't need any new gas-fired power plants and we should retire old ones as soon as possible. Transportation, we need increased transit service and frequency, moving towards electric buses and safe pedestrian and bike paths, and then faster adoption of electric vehicles, and we need to make sure we build enough charging stations. So this aspect of transitioning away from fossil fuels gets its own slide because it's so important and it's widely misunderstood. We actually need to ramp down fossil fuel production. And the reason why is because actually just producing it is one of the major sources of pollution globally, but in Colorado, it's the top contributor of greenhouse gas emissions. Fracked oil and gas production also uses and pollutes billions of gallons of fresh water. It also emits the most ozone-forming substances, and it gives off carcinogens that increase health risks up to 8 miles from wells. And this is definitely possible. We already have 38,000 wells that are producing, more that are getting ready to produce. And we produce so much more than we need in state that we don't need to keep expanding that. And this is just a slide, evidence to show that it is the top cause of greenhouse gas emissions. So this area here that I've colored in pink that says natural gas and oil systems, That's what's going to jump out at you first, and that's already the biggest source. It's bigger than electric power, but also hidden within this residential, commercial, and industrial fuel use is additional emissions from the oil and gas extraction industry. Upstream and midstream, which is part of the oil and gas production industry, they burn fuel, and that is counted in this section instead of being counted over here. So it's these two added together are all the greenhouse gas emissions from producing fracked oil and gas in Colorado. And we talked earlier about other industries being very important to our economy, and this slide just shows that the oil and gas industry is actually a very small slice of the pie in contributing to our economy. And truly, the health costs from the extraction are far outweigh this revenue that comes in. This graph will give you the data to show your legislators. In red is the contribution to ozone substances that cause ozone from the oil and gas industry. Both of these ozone precursors are, most of those come from the oil and gas industry. And then here's some additional Colorado policy context. We've already talked about needing to consider the outsized impact of the oil and gas industry on our state. Legislators need to also think about the fact that we need money for good things here in Colorado, healthcare, education, but also funding this rapid transition and funding our adaptation to a hotter climate. And Tabor interferes with our ability to have enough money to tackle these issues now for a more prosperous, healthy community later. Data centers coming to Colorado will threaten progress if we don't set guardrails in. So that's another thing to consider. And I'm nearing the end of my presentation here. I'm happy to answer questions and delve in and even do another training session if you need it. But I want to end with something positive here. We really can succeed here. Renewables are cheaper and healthier, and the US and Colorado must not get left behind in this renewable energy revolution. This slide, once you get this, will have a link to the UN Secretary General's speech, Antonio Guterres, saying that we're really on the cusp of a new era. The sun is rising on a clean energy age. Renewables basically should be unstoppable because they make economic sense. They give us energy security and sovereignty, and they're very accessible. So if you want more quotes from that speech, you will have the link there. And this is just a slide showing that even without subsidizing renewables, using natural gas or fossil gas for energy is far more expensive than wind, solar, and battery, both in the winter and the summer. And this slide just shows the progress that is happening with renewables, but it also shows that the US is lagging behind China, for instance. And it shows that Colorado is lagging far behind Texas. Texas, the red state, understands the economic implications here, understands that it's way more affordable and more resilient. So Colorado needs to catch up. As I said, you don't need to know all of these facts. You'll have them at your fingertips if you want with the slides. You'll have a packet to give to your legislators. What's most important is really conveying how important this is to you and then making the ask at the end and finding out if your legislator is committed to this and can we count on them. And with that, I will end. I see that Senator Cutter has joined us and excited to have you with us, Senator